This program is intended for mature audiences. The views and opinions expressed on Data and Dissonance are those of the hosts and panelists and are presented for discussion, analysis, and entertainment purposes only. We cover real-world events, political narratives, and cultural issues. And while we strive for accuracy, some segments include opinion, satire, and interpretation. If you're looking for safe spaces and perfectly filtered conversations, this probably isn't it. But if you're here to hear multiple perspectives, challenge your thinking, and engage with ideas that may not always align with your own, then you're in the right place.
Something doesn't add up, and people are starting to notice. Not just one story, not just one headline, but a pattern where the numbers don't match the narrative, the messaging doesn't match reality, and the people in charge always seem to be playing by a different set of rules than everyone else. And whether it's media spin, political money, or the quiet things happening behind closed doors, there's this growing feeling that what we're being told isn't the full picture. Because here's the truth. People aren't just reacting anymore. They're questioning, they're digging, they're comparing, they're asking why things look one way on paper and completely different in real life. And tonight, we're stepping right into that tension, where perception meets reality, where facts get blurred by narrative, and where the line between truth and spin gets harder to see by the day. All right, let's bring in the crew, because it's Friday, and that means we're not just breaking things down, we're tearing them apart. First up, Brian is in the building, and you already know what that means. It's MAGA Fire Friday, and he's coming in hot. No filter, no hesitation, and absolutely no patience for what he sees as political nonsense. If there's hypocrisy, spin, or anything that smells even slightly off, Brian's not just calling it out, he's lighting it up. Rachel's here as always, bringing that balance, that measured perspective, and the ability to cut through the noise and actually get to what's real. While everyone else is reacting, she's analyzing. And when things start getting exaggerated or twisted, she's the one pulling it back to facts, context, and what can actually be proven. Daniel's ready too. And if you think the story ends at the headline, you haven't been paying attention. He's connecting dots, asking the questions most people don't think to ask, and pushing into the what's really going on behind this territory that makes people either think deeper or get very uncomfortable. And Skylar is back in the mix, bringing that progressive perspective, challenging the narrative from the other side, and making sure this conversation doesn't turn into an echo chamber. Whether you agree with her or not, she's going to push back, and that's exactly what this show is built for. And then there's me. I'm Artie, and I've been watching this game long enough to know when something feels off. We're not here to play politics. We're here to break it down, call it out, and figure out what's actually real underneath all the noise. All right, let's start here, because this one's either a reality check or a reality distortion, depending on how you look at it. Reports and claims have been circulating that Ilhan Omar, a sitting member of Congress, somehow went from being tied to tens of millions in net worth to reporting an income that looks closer to about $100,000 a year. And when people hear that, the reaction is immediate. Wait a second, which one is real? Because those two numbers don't just disagree, they live in completely different universes. Now here's where it gets interesting, and where things tend to get messy fast. Net worth isn't the same as annual salary. Members of Congress like Omar make a standard salary, roughly $174,000 a year. So seeing a six-figure income isn't shocking on paper. But what is raising eyebrows is the claim that her wealth was previously in the tens of millions. That's the part people are trying to reconcile. Because if that number was ever accurate, then the follow-up question is simple. Where did it go? Or was it ever really there to begin with? And that's what we're going to break down tonight. Not just the numbers, but the narrative. Because in today's media environment, numbers get thrown around fast, headlines get built even faster, and before you know it, people are arguing over something that may not even be grounded in verified financial disclosures. So Brian, I'm going to start with you, because I already know where you're going with this one.
Yeah, Artie, I'm going to say what a lot of people are thinking, but maybe not saying out loud. This is exactly why trust in politicians is sitting at rock bottom right now. Because whether this specific claim is exaggerated, misreported, or dead-on accurate, the fact that people are willing to believe it instantly tells you everything you need to know about how little confidence is left in the system. When someone hears Congress member went from $30 million to $100,000, they don't laugh it off. They go, yeah, that tracks. That's a problem. And here's the bigger issue for me. It's not just about Omar specifically. It's about the pattern people think they see across politics. Insider trading accusations, book deals, speaking fees, nonprofits, consulting gigs, you name it. The average American is grinding it out, watching inflation eat their paycheck, and then they look at Washington and feel like there's a completely different set of rules in play. So even if this specific situation turns out to be misunderstood, it feeds into a much bigger narrative that politicians somehow always come out ahead while everyone else is just trying to stay afloat.
Yeah, and that right there is exactly what I think people are feeling. It's not even about whether this specific number is right or wrong. It's that people are already at a point where they assume something's off. That's a trust issue, not just a political issue. But Rachel, let me bring you in here because this is where things can either get clarified or get even more distorted. When you see numbers like this floating around, what's your first move? What are you actually looking for?
I think this is exactly where we need to slow things down a bit, because there's a difference between suspicion and verified reality. Financial disclosures for members of Congress are public, but they're not always straightforward. They often show ranges, not exact numbers, and they include assets, liabilities, and investments that can fluctuate significantly year to year. So when you see a headline claiming a $30 million net worth, the first question should always be, where did that number come from? Because not all sources are equal, and not all estimates are credible. And on the flip side, reporting an income of around $100,000 to $174,000 aligns with what you'd expect for a congressional salary, especially depending on how income is categorized in a given filing. So what we may be looking at here isn't a dramatic financial collapse, but rather a misunderstanding or misrepresentation of two completely different financial metrics: net worth versus annual income. That doesn't mean there aren't valid questions about transparency in government finances, but it does mean we need to be careful not to treat viral claims as established facts without digging deeper.
And that's the part people don't always want to hear, but it matters. Because if we're mixing up net worth, income, estimates, and actual filings, then we're not even arguing about the same thing anymore. But at the same time, even when things are clarified, the suspicion doesn't go away. It just shifts. And Daniel, that's usually where you step in. Because whether it's real, exaggerated, or misunderstood, there's always a bigger pattern people think they're seeing. So what do you think is actually driving that?
Yeah, and this is where I'm going to take it a step further. Because whether this specific number is real or not almost doesn't matter. What matters is why these kinds of narratives keep popping up over and over again. Because it's not just Omar, it's both sides of the aisle. Different politicians, different headlines, same underlying theme. Money moving in ways that don't always make sense to the public. Now, am I saying there's some massive coordinated system hiding billions? Not necessarily, but I am saying there's a level of complexity in political finances that the average person doesn't have access to. Blind trusts, investments, partnerships, book deals, donor networks. It creates an environment where transparency exists, but clarity doesn't. And when people don't understand something, they fill in the gaps themselves. That's how you end up with numbers like $30 million floating around without clear verification. And once it's out there, it takes on a life of its own.
Yeah, and that's where it starts to get complicated. Because once people feel like something's being hidden, even if it's not, they start connecting dots that may or may not actually be there. And that's how these narratives take off. But Skylar, let me bring you in. Because there's another side to this too, and it matters. When stories like this start gaining traction, what's the risk if they're not grounded in solid information?
And I think this is exactly why misinformation spreads so easily, because people are already primed to distrust the system. So anything that confirms that feeling gets traction immediately. But we also have to be honest about the responsibility that comes with discussing these topics publicly. Throwing around massive net worth claims without verified sources doesn't just raise questions, it can actively distort reality and unfairly target individuals. At the same time, I agree with part of what Brian said. There is a broader frustration with wealth and politics, and it's not coming out of nowhere. But if we're going to have that conversation, it needs to be grounded in facts, not viral headlines. Because otherwise, we're not holding anyone accountable. We're just adding more noise to an already chaotic information environment.
And that right there, that tension between suspicion and proof, that's where this entire story lives. Because on one side, you've got people saying, this doesn't add up. And on the other side, you've got the reality that not everything being shared online is accurate or complete. And in between those two, that's where trust either gets rebuilt or completely falls apart. So whether this turns out to be a misunderstanding, an exaggeration, or something worth digging deeper into, the bigger takeaway is this. People are paying attention to the money now in a way they haven't before. And once that door is open, it doesn't just apply to one politician, it applies to all of them. And that raises the real question going forward. Are we finally going to get real transparency in how power and money intersect in this country? Or are we just going to keep arguing over headlines while the full picture stays just out of reach? All right, let's shift gears a little, but not really, because this still ties directly into the bigger theme tonight. Perception versus reality, and who controls the narrative. Because over the past few years, something has changed, and it's not subtle. What used to be late-night comedy has turned into something very different, and people are starting to call it out more openly than ever before. Shows like The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, once built on humor, satire, and poking fun at everyone, are now being accused of leaning heavily in one direction politically. And it's not just casual criticism anymore. Viewers are asking a bigger question. When does comedy stop being comedy and start becoming messaging? Because if the jokes only ever land on one side of the aisle, people stop seeing it as entertainment and start seeing it as something else entirely. And here's where it gets interesting, because defenders say this is just the evolution of satire, that comedians have always had a point of view. But critics argue there's a difference between having a perspective and becoming a consistent mouthpiece for one political narrative. So, Brian, I already know you've got thoughts on this. What are we really watching at this point?
Artie, I'll say it straight. This isn't comedy anymore. It's activism with a laugh track. And people see it, they feel it, and that's exactly why so many have tuned out. Because when every monologue sounds like a campaign speech dressed up as a joke, it stops being entertaining and starts feeling like you're being talked at instead of entertained. And look, I'm not saying comedians can't have opinions. They always have. But what made late night great back in the day was that nobody was off limits. Republicans got roasted, Democrats got roasted, celebrities got roasted, everyone got it. Now, it feels like one side gets mocked and the other side gets protected or framed as the good guys. And once that balance disappears, so does the trust. Because people aren't stupid. They can tell when something's being pushed instead of played for laughs.
Yeah, and that's where I think people are starting to check out. Because once it feels like you're being talked at instead of entertained, the whole thing changes. Comedy's supposed to disarm you, not line you up. And when it stops doing that, people don't just laugh less, they trust it less. But Rachel, let me bring you in here because there's another side to this. Media follows audiences, audiences follow narratives. So where does this shift actually come from?
I think there's truth in the idea that late night has shifted, but I also think we have to recognize why that shift happened. Media doesn't exist in a vacuum. It reflects its audience. And as audiences have become more politically divided, content has followed that division. Shows like The Late Show know who their viewers are. and they're tailoring content to match those expectations. That said, the criticism about balance isn't entirely unfounded. When satire consistently targets one side, it risks losing credibility as satire and becoming something closer to commentary. And once that line gets blurred, it changes how people interpret the content. What used to be seen as humor becomes interpreted as influence, and that's where the conversation gets more complicated.
And that's a fair point, because if the audience is changing, the content is going to follow. That's just reality. But here's where I start to lean a little skeptical, because even if it starts organically, it doesn't always stay that way. Over time, patterns form, messaging tightens up, and suddenly it's not just reacting to the audience, it's shaping them. And Daniel, that's your lane. When you look at something like this, what do you see underneath it?
Yeah, and this is where I start asking the bigger question. Who benefits from that shift? Because when entertainment and messaging start overlapping, it's not just about jokes anymore, it's about shaping perception. And whether it's intentional or just the natural direction things have gone, the end result is the same. People are being influenced while thinking they're just being entertained. And here's the thing. Most people don't fact-check a joke. They hear it, they laugh, and it reinforces whatever they already believe. That's powerful. So, if late night consistently leans one direction, even subtly, over time, it builds a narrative in the background. Not through hard news, not through speeches, but through repetition. And repetition is where influence really starts to take hold.
And that's where it starts to blur the line between influence and entertainment. Because like you said, repetition matters. The more something gets reinforced, the more it sticks, whether people realize it or not. But Skylar, I want your take on this because not everyone sees this as a problem. Some people say this is just comedians being honest about what they believe. So where do you land on that?
Or, and hear me out, it could just be that the people creating these shows genuinely believe what they're saying, and their audience agrees with them. Not everything is a coordinated influence campaign. Sometimes it's just alignment between creators and viewers. And historically, satire has always had a target. It's not meant to be perfectly balanced. It's meant to challenge power structures as the comedian sees them. That said, I do think there's a valid conversation around diversity of perspective in media overall. If people feel like their views aren't represented, they're going to disengage or seek out alternatives. But that doesn't necessarily mean the content itself is wrong. It just means the audience landscape is more fragmented than it used to be.
And that's where this gets bigger than just late-night TV. Because this isn't just about jokes. It's about trust, influence, and where people go to shape their understanding of the world. If entertainment becomes one-sided, people stop seeing it as harmless and start questioning what's behind it. And once that question gets planted, it doesn't just apply to comedy. It spreads to news, to politics, to everything. Because at the end of the day, people don't just want to laugh. They want to feel like they're not being played. So the real question is this: are we watching comedy evolve with the times? Or are we watching something else entirely take its place? All right, let's pick up the pace, because it's Friday, and that means it's time for the lightning round. Quick hits, big stories, no overthinking it. Just reactions, instincts, and what actually matters beneath the headline. We're not breaking these down piece by piece. We're gut-checking them, calling them as we see them, and moving fast. So I'm throwing these out one by one. Panel, give me your read, your reaction, and what people should actually be paying attention to. Let's go. Border crossings ticking back up, resources stretched, and once again the conversation is heating up, but the solutions still feel stuck. Are we seeing real progress, or the same cycle playing out again?
This is the same movie on repeat, Artie, just a different week and a different headline. People on the ground are dealing with the reality of it, while politicians argue about messaging. And that disconnect is exactly why frustration keeps building. Until there's actual enforcement and consistency, nothing changes, and people know it.
There's definitely a cycle here, but it's also a complex issue that doesn't have a single solution. Enforcement, policy, humanitarian concerns, they all collide at the border, and every administration struggles to balance them. The problem is, long-term solutions don't fit into short-term political timelines.
What I look at is when it becomes a headline and when it doesn't. Because the situation doesn't just suddenly change overnight, but coverage does. That tells me there's more going on in terms of narrative timing than people realize.
And we can't ignore the human side of this. These are people, families, real situations, not just numbers. Policy matters, but so does how we treat people in the process. And that part often gets lost in the political back and forth.
On paper, some indicators say things are stabilizing, but ask the average person and they'll tell you it still feels tight. So what matters more right now, the data or the reality people are living?
People don't live on charts. They live on paychecks. And those paychecks aren't going as far as they used to. You can spin numbers all day, but when groceries, gas, and bills keep climbing, people feel that immediately. That's the real economy.
Both matter, honestly. Data gives us a broader picture, but lived experience tells us how those trends are actually impacting people. When there's a gap between the two, that's where trust starts to erode.
That gap is exactly what I watch, because perception drives behavior. If people feel like things are bad, they act accordingly, and that can shape the economy just as much as the numbers themselves.
And we should also ask, who's benefiting when things are stabilizing? Because for some people, things may be improving, but for others, especially working-class families, it still feels like they're falling behind.
Polls continue to show declining trust in media across the board. So here's the question. Is the media failing the public, or has the public just stopped believing anything at all?
It's both, but the media started it. When people feel like they're being told what to think instead of what's happening, they check out. Trust is hard to earn and easy to lose. And right now, it's gone.
There's definitely been a breakdown in trust, but it's also tied to how fragmented information has become. People can now choose sources that align with their views, which reinforces belief but doesn't always build understanding.
And that fragmentation creates echo chambers, different groups living in completely different realities. Once that happens, it's not just about trust in media, it's about trust in each other.
But rebuilding trust requires accountability on all sides: media, politicians, and even audiences. If everyone just digs into their own perspective, nothing improves.
And there it is. That's the pulse right now. Border pressure, economic tension, and a growing distrust in the systems that are supposed to keep people informed. Different angles, different takes, but one common thread. People are paying attention, and they're asking harder questions than they used to. And whether you agree with these takes or not, the reality is this. Things feel different right now. Less certainty, more skepticism, and a growing sense that what you're being told might not be the whole story.
All right, before we keep rolling, let's take a second to talk about something we actually can control. And that's how you show up, what you stand for, and how you represent it. Because Data and Dissonance isn't just a podcast, it's a mindset. It's about thinking for yourself, questioning what you're told, and not being afraid to stand a little different in a world that keeps trying to push everyone into the same lane. And that's exactly what our merch is built around. We've got the full lineup ready to go, from the everyday wear to the conversation starters. Hoodies, tees, hats, mugs, tote bags, and bumper stickers that don't just blend in, they say something. Whether it's speak truth, stir thought, or one of the newer designs like make Orwell fiction again, or keep your feelings off my freedoms. These aren't just slogans, they're signals. You wear it, you carry it, you put it on your truck. You're letting people know exactly where you stand without saying a word. And then there's the coffee. Because let's be honest, this show runs on caffeine and conviction. You've got the High Lakes Light Roast if you want something smooth and bright to kickstart your morning, the Rock Creek Medium Roast for that balanced, everyday grind, and the Bitterroot Dark French Roast when you want something bold enough to match the conversations we're having here. Whole bean or ground, roasted right here in the USA, and built for people who like their coffee the same way they like their opinions. Strong and unapologetic. So if you want to support the show, support the mission, and grab something that actually represents what we're about, head over to the merch store, links in the description like always. Every purchase helps keep this thing going, helps us grow, and helps us keep bringing you real conversations in a world that's getting harder to read by the day.
You know, when you step back and look at everything we covered tonight, from questions about political money to media influence to the way information gets filtered before it ever reaches you, there's a pattern that starts to come into focus. It's not always about one story being right or wrong. It's about how quickly narratives form and how easily people get pulled into them. And what that does over time is it changes how we see everything. It makes people more skeptical, more guarded, and in a lot of cases, more divided. Because when trust starts to slip, people don't just question the story, they start questioning the system behind it. And here's the reality. Most people aren't looking for perfection. They're looking for honesty. They're looking for consistency. They're looking for something that actually lines up with what they're experiencing in their everyday lives. But when there's a gap between what people are told and what they feel, that's where frustration builds. That's where doubt creeps in. And once that doubt takes hold, it doesn't just stay in one place, it spreads. It affects how people see government, media, leadership, even each other. And that's the part that should matter to all of us, no matter where we land politically. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about calling things out. It's about understanding them. It's about being willing to ask harder questions, even when the answers aren't simple. It's about not settling for the first headline, the loudest voice, or the easiest explanation. And yeah, that takes effort. It takes stepping outside your comfort zone, hearing perspectives you might not agree with, and actually thinking through what's real versus what just sounds good in the moment. But that's the only way you get closer to the truth. And right now, that matters more than ever. So as we close this one out, I'll leave you with this. Stay sharp, stay aware, and don't let anyone do your thinking for you. Because the moment you stop questioning is the moment you start accepting things at face value. And that's where people lose their footing. Keep asking, keep digging, and keep pushing for clarity in a world that's getting harder to read by the day. And we'll keep doing our part right here, breaking it down, calling it out, and giving you something real to think about. Remember to speak truth, stir thought.
Tonight's episode is brought to you by something built on the same foundation as this show. Truth, tension, and the willingness to ask what's really going on beneath the surface. The Caleb Rourke thriller series, including The Covenant Protocol, The Prophet Directive, and Black Echo Rising, isn't just another set of action stories. It's a deep dive into power, secrecy, and the kind of hidden forces that shape the world long before the public ever sees the headlines. If you like what we do here on Data Dissonance, these books take that same energy and turn it into a story you can't put down. And it doesn't stop there, because the music side of this brand hits just as hard. From the gritty, raw edge of Uncaged to the storytelling and soul behind Four Wheelers and Hallelujah, this isn't background noise. It's real, grounded, and built from lived experience. Songs that hit on struggle, resilience, faith, and everything in between. The same themes we talk about here, just told through a different lens. So if you want to support the show, go deeper into the world we're building and be part of something that's not afraid to say what others won't. Check out the books, check out the music, and hit the links in the description. It's all there, all connected, and all built with the same mission in mind.